So you just picked up your new Sony full frame mirrorless Alpha camera. Perhaps it's the a7s3 or the a74 or the a7R5. Regardless of which Alpha camera it is, I'm gonna show you 5 tips of how to get the most out of your camera, how to supercharge your camera. Here we go. Before we get started, like and subscribe for the algorithm. That helps me out a lot, all right? Let's go. We're gonna be using the a7 IV as our example. I've had this camera for a good while now and I've put it through its paces. This is not the official review that's coming in a little bit. If you have an Alpha camera, everything I'm gonna share here is usable across all the Alpha cameras and even some of the FX cameras, the FX3, the FX30, for example. Tip number 1 has to do with actually a weakness of this camera. This camera is prone to overheating. Unfortunately, that's the case. So what you do is you go in the menu, you go down all the way to the yellow menu. It's a little toolbox here. And what you do is you go down to your power options and you go to the very last option, which says auto power off temp. You want to change this from standard to high, because if you run this camera for even just an hour, the battery's going to get hot, the camera's going to start warming up, and this camera will shut off on you. I've experienced this so many times. But when you put this on high, it gives you a little bit more latitude and it doesn't shut off on you as quickly. All right, so that's tip number 1. What is tip number 2? Custom buttons. This will work on the a7 IV, the a7R5, the a7s3, and some other full frame Alpha cameras as well. Go into your menus. So we're gonna go down to the yellow settings again, and we're gonna go to our Operation Customize. And I'm just gonna show you how to do this as a video shooter, because primarily I'm a video shooter. So let's go ahead and go to video. All right, the very first thing I'm gonna set is my wheels. We're gonna go down here to the very last one and we're gonna set our wheels. Now, I only set 3 of these. I don't need 4, I just need 3, because I first wanna set this as my AV or my aperture. So the wheel here in the front, I'm gonna set as the aperture wheel. The reason why I love to set this as the aperture wheel, because it's right next to the lens, right? So that tells me this button controls the lens. This should be your number 1 way to control exposure outside of adding or taking away lights if you can, okay? We're gonna set this as the aperture. Number 2, second thing is we're gonna set the ISO. So this button right here to the one on the left, I set as the ISO right there. So basically, aperture, and directly behind it, ISO. So physical light, artificial light. So then finally, I set this last gauge up here on top, the one to the far right, as my shutter, right? And the reason why I set this as my shutter is because this one has a lock key. I'm not using the shutter to control exposure as a video shooter, because you want to obey that shutter angle rule. You want to have your shutter double your frame rate. So that's tip number 3, lock your shutter. The very next thing we're going to assign is this button right here below the AF on button. So you have this little grippy button right here. It feels really grippy. That one right there. We're going to assign that button to what we call Super 35. Button number 1 on the camera. We're going to click it and we're going to go to the first image quality settings here, and at the very bottom you'll see APS-C Super 35. Click that. Boom, that button is set. That's the second thing we're gonna do. But the last thing we're gonna do here is we're gonna set this AEL button. I never use this AEL button, so I'm gonna change it and set it for something interesting, right? We're gonna go to rear 1 finally, and we're gonna set this AEL button. I like to set mine to zoom. Go all the way down to zoom, boom, hit that, and now that AEL button is set. Right now I'm using the Sigma 16 to 28. Because of some of the features of these cameras, this lens doesn't just have to be a 16 to 38. We can make it a little bit more versatile than that. Remember, we set this little grip button here to APS-C mode and crop in on the lens. That gets you a little bit more reach. It's a 1.5 crop. So here I'm at 16, here I'm at 28. Now if I hit Super 35, look at that. Takes me a little bit closer. So now this lens effectively goes from a 16 to a 28 and becomes a 24 to 42, right? So now we're dealing with a 24 to 42. So let's see the difference. Here's our 16 and here's our 28. And now here's our 24, here's our 42. So as you can see, we got a lot more reach. Well, what if you still needed more reach? Well, remember, we set this AEL button up here as a zoom button. So what happens when you click this AEL button? Well, look, all of a sudden now, Sony has a technology called clear image zoom. You can zoom in on the image by another 1.5 crop. So we hit that and we zoom in by another 1.5 crop. So all of a sudden now the lens can go even further. What that means is we've done a 1.5 crop twice, which means we've done a 2x crop. Now we've doubled our range. So this 16 to 24 is now effectively, it's a 16 to 56. Because you're shooting 4K, especially on a camera like this where you're oversample, it's still gonna look great. It's gonna look like a 4K image. You're not really losing that much quality and it's still a 4K image. It's still gonna look very good. There we go. So that's your 5 tips for today. Let's review. Turn your camera on high overheating settings so it doesn't overheat as often. Tip number 2, assign your custom buttons. Tip number 3, set your shutter to this lockable button here. Tip number 4, use your APS-C mode to get a 1.5 zoom. So effectively a 16 to 28 becomes a 24 to 42, and use clear image zoom as your AEL button. So now you can 2x your lenses. So a 16 to 28 becomes a 16 to 56. Okay, that's it, we're done. So support me by subscribing to this video and liking it. Now leave a comment as well. I'm all ears. I would love to hear from you.